studied theater and psychology all the way up north at Loyola University. And then after college, I bopped around to a lot of the comedy theaters through here. So I trained at Second City, and I currently teach, and I coach, and I perform at some smaller theaters all throughout Chicago, mostly doing improv comedy. Well, that's just a little bit about me. Do I have any other Chicagoans on board here? Any other locals? Yeah, oh, we got a lot of locals here. What neighborhood are you from? Oak Lawn, all right, nice, yeah. Naperville, all right. Other Chicagoans from the back. Where? Streeterville, all right. Right here in the city, yeah. Pullman Square, all right, nice, yeah. Schaumburg, all right, cool. What about just outside Chicago, my other Midwesterners? Where are you coming from to come see our tour today? Where? New York! Alright, not quite Midwest. Almost there, though. Let's just go out to our nation, though. Where are people coming from outside the Midwest? We got New York, India, alright. Venezuela, nice. North Carolina, Philippines, welcome. Yeah, what more? South Korea, welcome.
Nepal.
Nepal?
Yes.
Welcome, yeah. The UK, welcome. Texas, all right, welcome everybody. So excited to have you all here on board to see Chicago's amazing architecture while we cruise down the Chicago River. I always like to start my tours after figuring out where everyone is from with a brief overview of several different styles of architecture that we're going to see today along our tour. We'll see a lot of buildings from the 1920s. And in a lot of these buildings, we'll see references to classical architecture. So we'll see Greek columns and Roman archways. These buildings from the 1920s, from that Beaux-Art style of architecture, usually have great symmetry throughout their buildings to create these beautiful designs. And so we like to call these buildings from the 1920s our wedding cake style buildings, because they've got so much of this frosting on the outside filled with references to some of that classical architecture. So we're going to see the Insurance Exchange building coming up on the right side in a little bit, where we'll get to see a great example of this wedding cake style building with Greek columns right towards the top of the building. We'll get to see the symmetry. But eventually, our architects start stripping away some of that frosting. So right next to that Insurance Exchange building, we'll get to see an Art Deco building. And we see that Art Deco period coming about the later 1920s to the 1930s. And we're probably beginning to get that look of the Insurance Exchange building just off to the right with the Greek columns towards the top. It looks exactly like a wedding cake with that white exterior all around the building. But just to the right of that Insurance Exchange building, we see the Board of Trade. That's the building that's got the sculpture on the top. That is a 3-story sculpture on the top of that building. It is series, the Roman goddess of rain. And once we get into that 1930s part of Art Deco, we'll see architects refer to what goes on inside the building with that frosting on the outside. So that's why we have that Roman goddess of rain on the Board of Trade. That Board of Trade building created the first grading system for grain. We used to have grain elevators lining the banks of the Chicago River. It would all come here to Chicago, and then we would ship it all out to the rest of the country. So that whole building has a theme of grains. If you walk into the lobby, you'll see stalks of wheat and stalks of corn in the railings and on the elevators, all celebrating what that goes on inside that building. But eventually our architects get bored of all of the frosting, and they start stripping all of it away, until we're left with our more modernism era of architecture. We see a lot of our modernism buildings between the 1950s and 70s. So I always like to point out that Sears Tower that we're approaching. Just ahead, that dark tower that's got the two antennas on the top of it, that's our tallest in the city, the Sears Tower. Built in 1974, it was also the tallest in the world until it was overtaken by the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. But from here, we can see the observatory, including the 5 glass boxes that we'll see protruding from that observatory at that top level. Now, Sears Tower is 1,300 feet tall without the antennas, but including the antennas, it's 1,700 feet tall. Now, we never include the antennas in the height of a building because those are seen as functional pieces of technology that might need to be replaced. Now, we never are going to replace those antennas. We'll just keep fixing them and keeping them up there. But since they're seen as that piece of technology, they never get added to the height of a building. If an architect wanted to put a decorative pole on the top of the building that no one could go inside of, that would still count towards the height of the building. So that sculpture on the Board of Trade does count towards the height of that building, which was the tallest in the city in 1930. But after we pass this bridge, we'll see more examples of these modernist style buildings. The just the cake style, since we don't get to see any of that frosting all along the outside. While we travel through the south branch of the river here on our left side, we are passing by 4 modernist buildings that were all built by the same architecture firm, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. And the first one that we're passing on the left here is called Gateway 4. It was the latest of these buildings, built in the 1980s. And we can see it looks probably the most futuristic. It's even got a curve in the building to represent this curve in the Chicago River where it is. And a lot of our 1980s modernism and postmodern buildings might look a little bit more like that, reflecting those building materials, whereas this next building on our left is from the 1970s. So it's still a great example of that just that modernism style, but we see this much lighter exterior. Almost looks a little bit like a checkerboard. We'll see a lot of that thicker, lighter color exterior in these modernist buildings from the 1970s. And then the next buildings coming up on our left are from the 1960s. So they're even earlier than the lighter color exterior. We don't have as much checkerboard. We have the dark steel and those dark tinted windows. It's very classic 1960s modernist. We also like to call this modernist style the international style, because you can pick up any of these buildings, put them in another city, and they would make perfect sense. But eventually, our postmodern architects want to pay tribute to their surrounding environment. We are going to pass a very exciting postmodern building coming up on our right side. This is the Chicago Merck building. And the architects had to build a huge trading floor in this building. And whenever you're building a trading floor, you don't want there to be any internal columns or walls blocking the view of the columns, because they want to be able to see everybody's hand motions. So there's no internal columns holding up the ceiling in between these 2 office towers on our right side. They built a 40,000 square foot trading floor, and in order to keep the ceiling up, they built those 2 towers arched outwards, and then the weight of the ceiling brought it all back straight. So that's what they're able to build a 40,000 square foot room with no columns blocking the views, nothing needed to hold up that ceiling, just the architecture from the top suspending it. And after we cross this next bridge, we'll be in between 2 older buildings from 1929. Over on our left, we'll get a good look at the old 2 North Riverside Plaza. This was our old Daily News building. It's got this kind of sphinx-like shape to it. We'll see a lot of references to Egyptian art and culture in the 1930s Art Deco period because of the very recent excavation of King Tut's tomb in the 1920s. So they put some Egyptian references into a lot of our architecture in the 1920s. But also in that old daily news buildings, you can see carvings of ancient scribes recording the news. Because this one also, 1929, right in that heart of architecture. So our architects like to describe what's going on inside the building with a lot of that art that's on the outside. So a lot of our buildings that will pass on this left side were all built over active train tracks. You can tell that very clearly in the next building coming up on the left. It almost looks like it's upside down. It gets narrower down at the bottom. This is 150 North Riverside. And this building gets so narrow down at the bottom because all of the structural support is wedged in between the river and active train tracks that are on the other side. So they only have about 39 feet wide at its widest in order to build all of the structural support that they can. But they still wanted to build a 55-story tall tower. Even after it widens out at the 8th floor, it looks dangerous looking up at it from here. Like, how can we even get up there? How is it not falling over, especially with all of the wind that we have here in Chicago? Well, that building uses what's called a tube-slosh dampening system. So all the way at the top of that tower, they have a huge tank of water that holds over 160,000 gallons of water. And whenever the wind blows one way, the water sloshes the other. We're getting a great look at that now. We'll see those trains pass probably another time or two during this tour. Oh, like maybe right now. They pass by about 500 times a day. And now we are in our confluence point. This area of the Chicago River is called Wolf Point. This is where our city was first founded. We used to have bars, taverns on all of the corners here of Wolf Point and ferry boats that would take people around in the 1830s. If you look at this location on a map, the shape of the river here makes a Y shape, like the letter Y. And we call this area Wolf Point. And since it's where our city was founded, it's very important to us. So we've hidden little Ys all over the city as a reference to this spot in the river. In fact, you can even see some in the railings just off to the right, in the bottom of that building. But you can also see little Ys, sometimes in the corners of City Hall, sometimes on some train stations and light posts. They are all over maybe here, but you'll also find one behind the Chicago Theater marquee. So once you know what to look for, that little reference to Wolf Point, this Y shape, you'll see it all over the city. And as we cruise through this north branch of the river, we're going to see a lot of evidence of the older industries that were built all along the river. Like this old cold storage warehouse that we're passing on the left. This one was built in 1898, so this is one of the oldest buildings that we'll pass on this tour. You can see where they had to carve into the building to build out the balconies when they converted it into residences in the 1980s. And those walls are really, really thick in that building because that one was a cold storage warehouse. So that's why they had to carve into it. And inside they found pork and horsehair used as insulation inside that building. But we'll see even more old warehouse buildings that have been converted into residences. They usually don't carve into the building to build out the balconies. They will typically add them on afterwards with that kind of sheet metal, and we'll see some examples of that coming up all throughout this neighborhood. All on our right side, we are cruising past the River North neighborhood, called that because it is north of the main branch of the Chicago River, even though it is technically east of us here. River North is home to a lot of high-end art dealerships, but there's also some tech companies and, of course, some high-end residences. It was revitalized in the 1970s, So we'll still see some of the old warehouse buildings from the 1920s and earlier remaining. Some have been converted into residences while others were destroyed or are being used for tech companies. We can see an old warehouse building with added-on balconies coming up on our right side here. And pretty soon after we cross this bridge, we'll see our old Chicago Tribune printing press. It was also built right here along the river. They built that printing press right here because they wanted boats to be able to pull right up to the building to offload fresh paper for newspaper printing. So they built those garage doors right at the edge of the river, and then they sent in a corps of engineers to make sure that the river was deep enough for the boats to pull right up to the building. And when the corps of engineers went down to that lower level of the river, what they found was so much pollution and trash that they abandoned that idea entirely. And they never had barges come right up to that Chicago Tribune printing press. We will notice that it's under construction right now. They're planning to turn it into a casino. We have the first legal casino in the River North neighborhood that went just about last year. But now they're going to build what's going to be the first permanent casino in the city right here in this old Tribune warehouse. We're also passing by more high-end residences on the right side. This building that's got the white exoskeleton on it. That's another one where they didn't want internal columns or walls determining how people set up their homes. So they put all of the structural supports on the outside of the building. However, for the people living there, that means they have to stare out through some of those supports. They have an obstructed view as the bracing goes right through their window. So you would think that they'd actually pay cheaper than people who have an unobstructed view. But here in Chicago, that is seen as a perk because you get to see your architecture out your own window every time you look. So they actually charge more for those units with the obstructed view. And as we keep perusing, we'll get a quick glimpse of the John Hancock Tower, our other dark tower with the two antennas on it, just over those trees there. That building is infamous for charging more for those obstructed views. They have a 18-story X-bracing system that goes up and down the tower, and they made it cool to live on the X, so they charged way more for those units. Ahead on our right side, we're going to pass the buildings from the Aaron Montgomery Ward business. Aaron Montgomery Ward created the first mail order catalog with a money-back guarantee if you were not happy with your orders. It first started in the 1870s with a 10-page catalog, and by 1900 that catalog was 1,000 pages. So this building on our right was the administrative offices for Aaron Montgomery Ward, built in the 1930s. So it's very Art Deco. We can see a lot of vertical lines, uninterrupted, showing off the height of that building. And just like that other Board of Trade building that had a sculpture on it, this one also has a sculpture. It's called the Spirit of Progress, and we'll get a glimpse of her as soon as we pass this bridge on that inside corner of the administrative building. This next building on our right was also part of Montgomery Ward. This was the warehouse where people who worked as pickers would fill all of the orders. This building would have tens and thousands of items all scattered throughout it, and those pickers would start their days by putting on roller skates and skating around this huge concrete structure, putting each item into the order that people had on their list. So this boat is going to turn around here, and we're going to get another good look at the Spirit of Progress. We're also going to get some great looks of the sunset setting over there on the west side of us here. We're going to take a very brief break here, that way you can go down and maybe grab a refreshment from the bar, or take a restroom break if you need. I'll be back in just a few minutes with a lot more tour. Don't forget to take a picture of the sky and, of course, the Spirit of Progress on top of that Montgomery Ward building. So I'll see you guys in a few minutes. Enjoy your photo opportunity.